Welcome to the WRAL Daily Download. I'm Megan Glova. We're getting new insight into one issue that could be driving crime in Durham. Some criminals seem to not be facing consequences for carrying guns. WRAL Investigates reporter Sarah Krueger joins us now to explain what she discovered. Sarah, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Of course. So you uncovered some internal emails about a certain policy at the DA's office. Can you first tell us more about those emails and then what that policy is?
Yeah, of course. So this all started because we heard from concerned community members, and that's how a lot of our stories originate. So after that, I filed a records request and got an internal email, and what it showed was a senior police officer from the Durham Police Department writing to the lead assistant district attorney, that's Elizabeth Ingram, and he was really looking for some feedback, some constructive criticism. He said something along the lines of, hey, I was going through old cases and noticed this case of mine was dismissed, and it was a case for possession of a firearm by a felon. And he said he was wondering if there was anything on his end that he could do differently or that may have caused that dismissal. So the lead ADA, Ingram, she responded the next day and said she didn't think it was a good one for constructive possession. And she also wrote, and I'm quoting, DA DeBerry also has a particular philosophy/policy when it comes to firearm by felon charges that are not accompanied by violence or threats of violence. In keeping with that policy, I dismissed this case, end quote. So I want to mention I did reach out to the DA, to the DA's office, offering an interview, seeking an interview with her, the chance to hear her perspective on this and elaborate, and she declined. Her spokesperson sent me a statement by email instead saying they don't have a written or blanket policy when it comes to possession of firearm by a felon cases, and just talking about they have limited resources and have to prioritize based on public safety.
And with that mention of charges not accompanied by violence or threats of violence, is it safe to assume violent offenders are not getting those possession charges dropped against them?
So from what I found, no, I do not think it is safe to assume that, because the very case that the officer wrote in about, I looked into that man's background, and he does have a history of violent charges. So that was something that I reached back out to the DA's office to ask for further clarification, asking if the dismissal of that case in particular aligned with their philosophy/policy. And at this point, I have not heard anything back on that.
And can we even confirm how often or how many times this policy has been implemented?
No, that was another thing that I asked the DA's office was, do you all keep track of how many of these types of charges are dismissed? And they told me they do not.
Okay. So how does this policy differ from what other DAs do in our area? Does it even differ?
Yeah, so that's something I was curious about. So I reached out to a couple of other DAs in our area. So I reached out to the Cumberland County DA, Billy West, and he and his office, they have not yet responded. I also reached out to Wake County, who did respond, and the DA there, who's Lauren Freeman, she told me her office has a no-drop policy on these types of charges. So that really stands in stark contrast to what the ADA describes as the policy in Durham.
That's quite the opposite. Did you
Yes.
come across anywhere else, whether that be in our region or state, that seems to implement a similar policy?
I did not. And, the thing with these internal policies is usually they are just that. They are internal, not something that is often publicized or known by the public. And for this story, I spoke with a UNC law professor, Carissa Byrne-Hessick, and she specifically studies prosecutors. And she was saying the policy really intrigued her that I told her about at the Durham DA's office, and that she would love to know more about it and the rationale behind it.
What else did we hear from that law professor? Did she give any insight into if this kind of policy makes sense? Does it work legally?
Yeah, so she said, this is all within the bounds of what prosecutors do. It's called prosecutorial discretion. They get to decide what cases to try, which ones not to try, and those are decisions that every prosecutor and prosecutor's office makes all the time. But again, those are decisions that are not always known by the public. And she talked about, the public probably would want a little more transparency, would want to know more about the inner workings of these offices to see if they do agree with all of the policies, but that's just not how it usually works.
When we come back, what a former gang reduction strategy manager thinks this could mean for crime in Durham. Sarah, what did the former Durham County gang reduction strategy manager have to say about all this? Was he concerned about what this could mean for crime in Durham?
Yeah, so I talked to Jim Stite, and he worked for more than a decade in that role for Durham County, and now he's retired as of last year. But this was one thing that he specifically studied. That is why possession of firearm by a felon charges are dropped in Durham and the implications of that. And he published a report in 2022 that looked at that, and he was really concerned about it. He said even in his research from 2022, he had gone into the jail. He interviewed inmates to ask them as felons, as convicted felons, why they still carried guns. And he said some of them told him it's because they knew they wouldn't face any consequences for doing so. So he believed that this was something that was very much common knowledge, and people in Durham in these circuits were very much aware of. And he pointed out in his research, he found that at the state level, incarcerations for this charge were up about 10%, but in Durham, they were down more than 50%. So that mismatch there of, seemingly harsher penalties elsewhere in the state, but not so in Durham. And he did feel like it's really important, he still does, to hold people accountable for these charges because they are indicators of future involvement with violence, either as a suspect or as a victim. And so for the safety of society and for the safety of themselves, he felt it's important to prosecute these.
Yeah, that makes sense. Did anything else stand out to you during this investigation? Seems like we haven't covered something like this before.
Yeah, I think just, the context here. So I've been reporting at WRAL since 2016. I started off before being investigative reporter as the Durham reporter. So I've done a lot of reporting on Durham. And we hear often, and I have heard often from police officers and from others in Durham with concerns about the number of guns on the streets in Durham. And we've reported on that extensively, and that there is this perception that the Durham district attorney is soft on crime. So I think all of that is important context just to understand this reporting, its relevancy, why it matters when we look at this larger puzzle of the issue of crime in Durham and what's driving it and the many people looking for solutions.
Right. Very interesting. Sarah, thank you so much. And you can find Sarah's full story up now on WRAL.com. And thank you for listening to the WRAL Daily Download. You can find more podcasts from WRAL News at WRAL.com. Search podcast. From sports to true crime, there are plenty of shows to keep you informed and entertained. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.